The wind howled as the blizzard raged outside, its icy fingers clawing at the small cabin. Ezra Brennan stood at the window, watching the snow swirl in frenzied patterns across the darkened landscape. He had long since stopped caring about the weather. The storm was a familiar companion, as constant as the grief that gnawed at him from within. For 5 years, the pain of losing Emma, his wife, and Grace, their little girl, had become his shadow. He could almost hear their laughter echo in the empty corners of the house. But tonight, the silence was different, strangely unsettling. Suddenly, a knock on the door shattered the quiet. Ezra frowned, thinking it must be the wind. But when it came again, louder, more insistent, his heart skipped a beat. No one ever came here, not in this weather. He slowly approached the door, a flicker of suspicion running through him. As he opened it, the figure standing on the threshold took him completely by surprise. "Mr. Brennan?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. "I'm Catherine Wells, your bride." Ezra blinked, the words not making sense. His first instinct was to slam the door and retreat into the warmth of the cabin. But something in her eyes stopped him. She wasn't a stranger to fear, that much was clear. But it was the letter she held in her trembling hand that caught his attention. "I didn't order a bride," Ezra said, his voice thick with disbelief. Catherine stepped closer, showing him the letter with a flourish. It was an official-looking document, addressed to him, but the signature was unmistakably not his. A forged signature, no doubt. "Look, I can explain," she began, but Ezra barely heard her. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible situation. Who would do this? Who would send a woman halfway across the country to marry a man who never asked for her? "Who sent you?" Ezra asked, his voice tinged with anger now. "Who did this?" But before she could answer, the wind picked up again, howling like a wild animal, and Ezra's attention snapped back to the storm. He could barely see past the porch now. The snow had turned the world into a white blur. Catherine was shivering, her face pale against the cold. She didn't wait for an invitation. "Mr. Brennan, please," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm not safe out here. I don't have anywhere else to go. Please let me in." The plea in her eyes was unmistakable, but Ezra hesitated. He didn't want company, least of all someone who had arrived under such bizarre and unsettling circumstances. But as the wind howled louder, the decision became clear. If he sent her out into that storm, she might not survive. And in that moment, he realized he had no choice. "Come in," he said, stepping aside to let her pass. The moment the door closed behind her, the warmth of the cabin seemed to wrap around her like a lifeline. She was trembling from the cold, but her eyes were sharp, scanning the room as if trying to get her bearings. Ezra closed his eyes for a moment, frustrated by the turn of events. He had enough trouble of his own. Why was this happening to him? They stood in awkward silence, both of them unsure of what to do next. The storm raged outside, and the tension between them grew thicker by the second. Neither of them had wanted this arrangement, but there was no turning back now. Catherine cleared her throat. "I didn't ask for this either, Mr. Brennan," she said softly. I'm here because I have no choice." Ezra nodded, though his mind was still a blur of questions. "I get that," he muttered, more to himself than to her. The storm outside continued its relentless assault, and the cabin creaked with the wind's fury. Ezra took a deep breath, knowing that there was no escaping the strange turn of events. For now, they would have to endure this strange partnership, and in the coming days, perhaps they would learn more about each other than they ever planned to. As Catherine settled by the fire, trying to warm up, Ezra couldn't help but feel the weight of his own loneliness pressing down on him once more. She was a stranger, and yet, in this moment, she was the only other person in the world who seemed as lost as he was. A sudden noise broke his thoughts, a soft sob. He looked over at Catherine, who had her hand pressed to her face, trying to hide the tears. He hadn't expected this, but in that moment, something shifted inside him. Despite everything, despite the absurdity of it all, there was a spark of curiosity. Who was this woman? And why had she come here? The storm outside worsened, and for the first time in years, Ezra felt a strange sensation in his chest. He wasn't alone anymore. As he watched her, he couldn't help but wonder, what was he going to do with her? The third day of the storm dawned bleak and heavy, trapping them both in the small cabin with no sign of the snow easing up. Catherine had kept mostly to herself, the quiet tension between them growing with each passing hour. But that morning, as Ezra was stoking the fire, Catherine finally spoke up, her voice breaking through the silence. "What's with the nightmares?" she asked, her gaze steady. "I've heard you calling out in your sleep." Ezra froze, a wave of panic crashing over him. He hadn't realized she'd been listening, but the rawness of his grief was something he had hoped to keep hidden. His jaw tightened as he turned away, unwilling to face her. "Don't try to fix me," he muttered, his words colder than he intended. Catherine's eyes softened, but she didn't let it go. Instead, she produced the second letter she had found in the cabin the night before, the one she hadn't shown him yet. "I found this," she said, handing it over. Ezra took the paper reluctantly, reading it through clenched teeth. It was another forged letter, this one even more damning than the first, detailing the reason behind the whole scheme. The letter had been signed by Moses, the blacksmith. The betrayal hit him like a punch to the gut. Moses? Ezra spat, the name tasting bitter on his tongue. "He's the one who did this to me." Catherine nodded, her voice quiet but firm. "He said you needed saving, that you were dying inside, whether you knew it or not." Ezra's hands shook as he crumpled the letter, his anger rising. His best friend had played him like a fool. He had no right, he growled. No right to do this. He was shaking with a mix of rage and helplessness. Catherine watched him for a moment, then sighed deeply. "I didn't ask for this either, you know. I came here because I had nowhere else to go. I'm running from a life I thought I could escape." She looked down at her hands, her voice dropping to a softer tone. "My fiancé left me for my sister. My family disowned me. I had nothing left but shame, so I came west hoping to disappear. But now I don't know what's worse, being trapped here or going back." Ezra's heart tightened as her words sank in. Neither of them had asked for this arrangement, but they were stuck with it now. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and the idea of sending her away into the freezing wilderness felt unbearable. So, instead of fighting it, he came to an uncomfortable decision. "I can take you to town when the storm breaks," he said gruffly. "But you have no money, no place to go. You'll freeze out there." Catherine hesitated for a moment, her eyes thoughtful. "I could stay here," she said, finally breaking the silence. "But if I do, I'll need a place to sleep. I need to be practical. People will talk." Ezra didn't know why, but the idea of her leaving the cabin felt wrong. "You can stay," he said after a pause, "but we can't make this a permanent thing. It would be better if you stayed as a housekeeper, separate from me." Catherine's eyes narrowed. "A housekeeper?" she repeated, clearly not impressed. "How about this? If we do this, we'll get married. In name only. That way, people won't ask questions. You get help, and I get security." Ezra stared at her in stunned silence. "You want me to marry you? For real?" She shrugged, unfazed. "For 6 months, no strings attached. Then, after that, we can part ways. You're not going to get rid of me any other way." There was something about her bluntness that caught him off guard. She wasn't asking for love or promises, just a practical solution. He couldn't help but admire the strength in her. "Fine," he muttered, though the idea of being legally bound to someone for 6 months, even in name only, made him uncomfortable. 6 months. After that, you're free to go. The words hung between them, both of them knowing they hadn't fully spoken the truth of why they agreed to the arrangement. Catherine's eyes softened for just a moment, but she quickly masked it with a careful smile. Agreed. As the storm finally began to subside, they ventured into town together, announcing their quiet, practical marriage to the people who had known Ezra for years. The gossip would follow, but neither of them seemed to care about that for now. When they arrived at the blacksmith's forge, Moses was there, his expression unreadable as he met Ezra's gaze. "I did what I thought was best, Ezra," Moses said with a shrug. "You were dying inside. Needed saving, whether you admitted it or not." Ezra's anger flared again, but he held it in check. "You had no right," he muttered, but Moses only chuckled. "You'll thank me later," he said with a grin. Back in town, the whispers had already begun. Catherine could feel the eyes on her, the weight of judgment and speculation in the air. But as they made their way home, the discomfort of the situation was strangely familiar. She didn't want to be here, but neither did Ezra. And yet, they were bound together now, legally and practically. Neither of them had wanted it, but neither of them had a choice anymore. As they returned to the cabin, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. "This is going to be harder than I thought," she whispered to herself as Ezra closed the door behind them, sealing them into their new, strange life together. The days passed in a quiet, tentative rhythm, the spring thaw bringing an awkward kind of peace to the cabin. For the first few weeks, neither Ezra nor Catherine knew what to make of each other. The cabin was small, and despite the physical distance they maintained, Ezra building a partition to create separate spaces, the silence between them was heavy. But small moments began to break the ice. Catherine made coffee every morning, the kind Ezra had never been able to get right, and he began to fix things around the cabin, like her rocking chair that had fallen apart. These tiny gestures didn't speak of love or even affection, but they began to build something else, a quiet understanding. Catherine started a garden, and Ezra helped without being asked, his large hands working the soil with a kind of care he hadn't shown anything since Grace's death. One evening, he taught her to ride, his hands steady on her waist as she gripped the reins. The touch was accidental at first, but it left them both frozen, the air between them suddenly charged. As the weeks passed, the moments between them became less awkward. Catherine found herself standing beside him at Grace's grave one afternoon, saying nothing but feeling the weight of the shared silence. She had told him once that she had chosen to leave Boston loudly, rather than disappearing quietly. That truth had drawn Ezra closer, in a way he couldn't quite explain. He understood the kind of pain she carried, just as she understood his. It wasn't love yet, but it was something like it, fragile, tentative. Their lives began to intertwine in the small, unnoticed ways that only people who live close to each other understand. One evening, after they returned from town, they attended the local dance. Catherine was dancing with Moses, and Ezra watched them, something dark and unfamiliar stirring inside him. The jealousy surprised him, but what surprised him more was that Catherine didn't seem to notice. Later, he gave her a carved hairpin, a small, thoughtful gesture, and she wore it every day after that, a sign of something unspoken between them. But it wasn't enough to stop what came next. On the porch one evening, as the sun dipped low behind the mountains, Ezra found himself watching Catherine in the garden again, his thoughts scattered and restless. There was something about her that had begun to matter to him more than he was willing to admit. She was close, too close. The moment between them was thick with a kind of electricity, and then, without warning, they kissed. It was desperate, a collision of hunger and loneliness, both of them pouring years of longing and isolation into the kiss. When they finally pulled apart, Ezra's panic was immediate, raw. "I can't do this again," he whispered, backing away. Catherine stood there, breathless and confused, her face a mixture of shock and hurt. "You don't get to do this to me," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor underneath. But Ezra didn't stay to argue. He left, walking away into the gathering night, leaving her standing alone in the fading light. 3 days passed in painful silence. Neither of them spoke, neither of them knowing what to say. The stillness between them felt like a chasm. It wasn't until Catherine finally confronted him that the truth spilled out. "If you don't want this, I'll leave," she said, the words cutting through the heavy air. His anger broke then, and he exploded, all the pain of the last few years pouring out in a harsh, guttural shout. "I can't bury another person I love." The confession hung in the air, raw and bleeding. The truth was there. He was scared. Scared of opening himself up. Scared of losing someone else. Scared of living with the ghosts of his past. And yet, in that moment, it became clear that his fear was stronger than his love. Catherine's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of something deeper than she had let on before. "I'm still here, Ezra. I'm still here." But it wasn't enough. He wouldn't yield. Not yet. Not when the fear was still too big, too overwhelming. And so, she walked away, leaving him alone with the weight of his own unresolved emotions. Something had broken between them, and both of them felt it. There was no going back now. The arrival of a letter from Boston marked the beginning of a painful crossroads for Catherine. She'd been expecting it, in a way, but the harsh reality of it still stung. Her sister's words begged for forgiveness, a promise of full social restoration if Catherine would return home. The family was ready to embrace her again, to erase the shame that had followed her like a shadow. Everything Catherine had once dreamed of was being offered back to her. An escape from the life she had built with Ezra, a chance to return to a life of respectability and acceptance. But as she read the words, something inside her shifted. This wasn't what she wanted anymore. The very things she had once hoped for fell hollow now. The life she had built here, with Ezra, awkward and broken as it was, had become something more. She had never expected it, but the storms that had raged within her were starting to subside. There was peace here, however imperfect. Yet, that peace had come at a cost. Ezra had retreated into his grief, never once allowing himself to feel the warmth of love again, too scared to let go of his memories of grace. He had chosen fear over love, and in doing so, he had unknowingly closed her out. But she had no more time to wait. She couldn't stay here in limbo, hoping he would change. The storm had passed, but the one inside him raged still. "I'll leave at the end of the month," she told him, her voice calm but firm, as though the decision had already been made. Ezra's reaction was a mask of indifference, a carefully constructed barrier to hide the raw pain that threatened to overtake him. "That's probably for the best," he replied, his voice flat, though it carried an undercurrent of something more. Neither of them truly believed it, but they had no other choice but to pretend. Catherine didn't want to leave, not really, but staying and watching him drown in his own sorrow was a fate worse than any distance. Yet, even as she made the decision, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was abandoning something precious, something that might have been, if only Ezra hadn't been too scared to reach out. It was then that Moses, the blacksmith, appeared again. He had been watching the slow unraveling of the two of them from his position on the sidelines. And now, he stepped in with his usual bluntness. He caught Ezra alone in the forge, his rough hands steady on the anvil as he hammered away at a piece of iron. "You're really going to let her go?" Moses asked, his voice low, but filled with disbelief. Ezra didn't look up. "What else am I supposed to do?" he muttered, the words bitter in his mouth. Moses snorted. "You could stop being a damn coward, for one," he said. "Grief I understand, Ezra, but the rest of it? Cowardice. That's what I don't get." Ezra's grip tightened around the hammer, but Moses wasn't finished. "You think Grace would want this?" he continued, his words cutting through the fog of Ezra's mind. "You think she would want you to waste your life, scared of losing someone else? You're still alive, Ezra. You're still breathing. She wouldn't want you to let fear control you." The truth of Moses' words hit like a physical blow, but Ezra wasn't ready to face them. Not yet. "I can't do it, Moses. I can't lose anyone else. I've already lost too much." Moses just shook his head, his expression hardening. "Then you've already lost. You'll keep losing until you decide to let go of the past. He turned to leave, his footsteps heavy on the ground. It's not too late, Ezra. Not if you choose to live. The words hung in the air long after Moses had gone, and Ezra felt the weight of them pressing down on him. But still, he couldn't bring himself to act on them. He couldn't face the idea of truly letting go, of choosing love over fear. Then came the storm. Late May brought a violent, unseasonable storm that seemed to come out of nowhere. The winds picked up suddenly, dark clouds swirling on the horizon, and the air grew thick with the promise of something terrible. Ezra was inside when he saw it. A tornado forming, its swirling mass rising ominously from the earth. His first thought was Catherine. He had no idea where she was, but he knew she had gone to the far pasture to check on the fence earlier that day. The terror that gripped him was unlike anything he had ever felt. Without thinking, he ran for the door, his heart racing in his chest. "Catherine!" he shouted, his voice raw with panic. He grabbed his coat and headed toward the stables, praying that she was still in the barn or somewhere near the house. He could hear the wind howling, the ground beneath his feet shaking with the intensity of the storm's approach. It was almost as if the earth itself was coming alive, angry and violent. The storm was moving fast, and Ezra's thoughts were consumed with nothing but finding Catherine. He had to get to her to make sure she was safe. He rode out into the storm, shouting her name, the sound of the wind drowning out everything else. Then, through the swirling snow and rain, he saw her. She was on the ground, her horse spooked and running wild. She had been thrown, and the tornado was closing in. Ezra's heart stopped as he raced toward her, his horse kicking up mud and snow behind him. "Catherine!" he screamed, but the storm was so loud, he wasn't sure she could hear him. She was lying there, dazed, her eyes unfocused, as the wind picked up, tearing at everything in its path. Ezra reached her just as the tornado seemed to reach its peak. He grabbed her, pulling her up into his arms, feeling her tremble against him. "We need to get to the root cellar," he shouted over the wind, his voice strained with fear. Catherine didn't argue, didn't say a word. She simply nodded, clinging to him as they ran. The tornado was nearly on top of them, the wind ripping at their clothes, the earth shaking beneath their feet. They made it to the root cellar just in time, the door slamming shut behind them with a deafening thud. Inside, the world was dark, save for the faint glow of a lantern hanging on the wall. The storm raged above, but they were safe, at least for now. Ezra could hear her breathing, ragged and shaky, as they sat together in the darkness, the sound of the storm outside growing more violent with each passing second. "Are we going to die?" Catherine asked, her voice small, almost a whisper. Ezra pulled her close, his arms wrapped tightly around her. "No," he said, his voice firm. "We're not going to die. Not today. Not while I've got you." And in that moment, something inside Ezra shifted. It wasn't just the terror of the storm that had made him realize the truth. It was Catherine holding on to him, trusting him with her life, just as she had trusted him in the days since the storm had first trapped them together. He could feel her warmth against him, her heartbeat strong and steady, and he knew, with a certainty he had never felt before, that he couldn't lose her. "Not now. Not ever. I love you," he whispered, his voice hoarse. The words tumbled out before he could stop them, raw and unfiltered. "I love you. It terrifies me, but I love you." Catherine didn't respond immediately, and for a long moment, Ezra thought he had made a terrible mistake. But then she shifted in his arms, her hand reaching up to touch his face, her fingers trembling. "I love you too," she whispered back. "I've loved you since the day you let me stand with you at Grace's grave. Since the day you gave me that hairpin." And then, without another word, they kissed. It was slow and gentle at first, as if the storm above them had to pass before they could finally let go of everything else. But when they pulled away, there was no more doubt between them. They had found each other in the midst of the chaos, and somehow They had both survived. As the storm began to pass and the winds died down, Ezra and Catherine emerged from the cellar, blinking in the weak sunlight. The cabin was damaged, but it was still standing. And so were they, together. Like us, Catherine whispered, her voice soft, but filled with something more. Something that had started out as a mistake, but had turned into something beautiful. Ezra squeezed her hand, a smile tugging at his lips. Yeah, like us. The days following the storm were a blur of work, effort, and strange relief. Ezra and Catherine spent the week repairing the damage to the cabin, working side by side in a comfortable silence that had grown between them. The storm had stripped away the last of the walls they had kept between them. In the days that followed, the town rallied behind them, coming to help rebuild what had been torn apart. As much as Ezra had resented the thought of involving the community, the support they received was undeniable. Moses, ever the meddler, grinned from ear to ear, watching them work together, but even he couldn't hide the pride he felt. "Told you so," he said to Ezra one morning when they worked side by side, his voice light with a knowing tone. "I knew you'd come around. You two were always meant to be together, just needed a little push." Ezra grunted, his hands busy with a beam, but he couldn't deny that, somehow, Moses had been right. The unspoken tension between him and Catherine had dissolved in the storm, and now, in the calm after it, there was something undeniably real between them, something neither of them had been able to face until they were forced to. They worked for days, each hammer, each nail driving them closer to the kind of life they both had been avoiding. The cabin slowly took shape again, its walls rising, its foundation solidifying, just as their bond was becoming sturdier, more secure. The repair seemed like more than just physical work. They were repairing the space between them, mending the rift that had once felt impossible to bridge. Catherine, in particular, embraced the rhythm of life in the small cabin. She found herself at home in the community, something she hadn't thought possible when she'd first arrived, so lost in her own turmoil. Mrs. Garvey, the town's eldest matriarch, smiled at her whenever they crossed paths, approving of her quiet presence. "We're glad you stayed, dear," she told Catherine one afternoon as she stopped by to drop off some freshly baked bread. Catherine could only smile back, grateful for the unexpected sense of belonging. The cabin was slowly becoming more than just a place to stay. It was becoming home. The real shift came one evening as they stood before the cabin, now fully repaired, the setting sun casting a warm glow over everything. Ezra, a man who had spent years closed off from everything, finally seemed ready to open up. He reached out, taking Catherine's hand in his, and the simple touch felt like everything was finally aligning. "Catherine Wells Brennan," he said softly, his voice steady, as if he had finally found the courage to ask the question that had been on his mind for so long. "Got a nice ring to it." Catherine's heart skipped a beat at the sound of her full name. She looked up at him, her gaze soft, her lips curved in a quiet smile. "Are you asking me again?" she teased, a hint of laughter in her voice. Ezra chuckled, his usual guardedness melting away. "I am, and this time I mean every word." The air between them seemed to thrum with an energy neither of them could ignore. They had spent months circling around each other, afraid to let go, but now there was no more hesitation. Catherine squeezed his hand, a soft smile playing on her lips. Yes, yes, for real this time. The words were a promise, one they both needed to hear, even if it came after so much pain, so much confusion. They had built something real together, something that wasn't just about survival, but about living. And now, they were ready to take the next step. The wedding was a quiet affair, held in Cedar Bend's small church with the whole town in attendance. There was no grand ceremony, no extravagant celebration, just the two of them, standing before the preacher, surrounded by the people who had become their family. Moses, of course, was there, acting as their witness, his grin as wide as ever, proud to see his meddling come to fruition. Ezra's vows were simple, but they were everything he had never been able to say before. "I wasn't looking for you," he said, his voice deep and steady. "I was happy being lost." The words struck Catherine deeply, and she couldn't help but look at him, her heart full. "But you taught me loving again isn't betraying who I lost," he continued. "I promise to choose you every day, especially when I'm scared." The vows weren't perfect, but they were real, and for Catherine, that was enough. When it was her turn, she spoke from the heart. "I came here running from shame, but I found dignity," she said, her voice quiet but full of conviction. "You gave me a home where I'm seen, where I matter." She paused, meeting his gaze, her eyes soft but sure. "I promise to stand with you in storms and calm." The words seemed to hang in the air between them, unspoken promises that had been made long before the ceremony. Then they kissed, a soft, lingering kiss that sealed everything. The applause that followed felt almost like an afterthought, the crowd's cheers fading into the background as they stood there, bound together in a way they had never imagined. The reception was simple but filled with joy. The whole town danced, laughed, and celebrated their union. And for the first time in a long time, Ezra allowed himself to feel that joy. Catherine, too, was finally at peace. After the celebration, the two of them slipped away, walking through the quiet streets of Cedar Bend to the cemetery. They stood before Grace's grave, the night air cool against their skin. Ezra bent down to place a small bouquet of wildflowers on the grave, his heart full of emotion. Catherine, standing beside him, took a small wooden horse from her pocket and placed it on the grave as well. "For her," she said softly, her voice thick with unshed tears. Ezra's heart tightened as he looked at her, knowing how much she had come to mean to him and to Grace. "She'd like you," he said, his voice rough. "She'd have climbed all over you, asking questions, driving you crazy." Catherine smiled, a bittersweet expression on her face. "You do know her. She's in every time I choose hope over fear." They stood there for a while, side by side, honoring the past, but embracing the future. There was no replacing Grace, no erasing the memories of the woman they had both lost. But in that moment, there was a kind of peace between them, a quiet understanding that Grace had always wanted Ezra to find happiness again. And now he had. "Ready to go home?" Catherine asked, her voice gentle. Ezra smiled and took her hand. "Yeah, let's go home." The home they had built together. The home they were both ready to live in. The evening air was warm, the sun just dipping below the horizon as Catherine stood on the porch of their home, the same place where she had first arrived, confused and alone. Now, everything felt different. The cabin no longer felt like a cage, but like a sanctuary. The garden she had planted with such care was thriving, each bloom a testament to the life they were building together. Ezra rode in from the pasture, his figure silhouetted against the fading light. Catherine's heart skipped a beat as she saw him, just as it had when they first met. But this time, there was no hesitation, no walls between them. Ezra was home, and so was she. She had never expected to feel so at peace here. When she had arrived, she had been running from her past, from the shame that had followed her, but now the shame was gone. It had been replaced by something stronger, something more beautiful, the quiet certainty that she belonged here with Ezra. When he saw her standing there, he smiled. It wasn't the guarded, cautious smile he used to wear. It was something real, something warm. "Storm's coming," he said as he dismounted, his voice low, as if they were speaking of something more than just the weather. "Then we'd better get inside," she replied with a soft laugh. It wasn't the words, but the way they spoke them, as though they had already faced the storm together, as though they could face anything. They entered the cabin together, not as strangers or reluctant companions, but as partners. Inside, the cabin had transformed. It wasn't just Ezra's home anymore. It was their home. There were books on the shelves, her favorite novels stacked next to his tools. The kitchen was warm and inviting, the scent of fresh bread hanging in the air. Every inch of the space had become a reflection of both of them. "You've made it yours," Ezra said quietly, as if he couldn't quite believe it himself. "It's ours," she corrected him gently. The distinction wasn't just in the words. It was in the way they lived, the way they shared everything. She had brought something with her when she came here, something that had been missing in Ezra's life for far too long. And he, in turn, had given her the safety to grow, the freedom to heal. That evening, as they sat by the fire, the flickering light casting shadows on the walls, they spoke of the future, of the life they would build together. Catherine had once thought she could only find peace by returning to Boston, by accepting the life she had left behind. But now, she realized that peace had never been in that city. It had always been with Ezra in this small cabin on the edge of the world. She placed a hand on her belly, feeling the life growing inside her. It had been a shock at first, a surprise that neither of them had expected. But now, it was the most welcome surprise of all. "Are you scared?" she asked him, her voice soft but full of meaning. He looked at her, his eyes steady, the weight of everything they had been through reflected in them. "Terrified," he admitted, his voice low, but there was no fear in his words, only a deep, unspoken certainty. But not enough to run. Catherine smiled, her hand resting on his. "Good, because I need you here." He nodded, his hand covering hers. "I'm not going anywhere." They sat together in the silence, the fire crackling in the hearth, the outside world fading away. It was just the two of them now, in this little world they had created, a world of their own making. Outside, the storm began to pick up, the wind howling through the trees. But inside, it was safe. Inside, there was only warmth, only love, only the certainty that they had finally found their way to each other. As the storm raged on outside, Catherine closed her book and looked up at Ezra. "Do you ever think about that day?" she asked, her voice soft, almost wistful. He looked at her, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "Every day," he replied. "Regret it?" she asked, teasing him gently. He chuckled, his eyes warm. Not for a second. There was a comfort in the way they spoke, in the way they had found a rhythm in each other's company. It was a rhythm that had been built over months of shared silence and shared laughter, of small acts of kindness and deep, quiet understanding. Even when they fought, even when things were hard, they had never been so far apart. They were two halves of something whole. "Even when I drove you crazy?" she asked, her voice light with humor. He laughed then, a sound full of affection. "Especially then," he said, and she laughed too, the sound filling the room, chasing away the last of the shadows that had clung to them both for so long. They had both come a long way from the people they had been when they first met, two lost souls stumbling into each other's lives by accident. Now, they had found something more, a future, a home, a family. The world outside might have been stormy, but inside they were safe. The storm continued to rage that night, the wind howling against the windows, the rain beating down on the roof. But inside, the fire crackled, the warmth from the hearth filling the room, and outside, the world seemed so far away. Ezra looked at Catherine, his gaze full of love, full of something deeper than either of them had ever known. She smiled back at him, her heart full. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" he asked, his voice full of quiet wonder. "For being brave enough to let me stay," she said, her words simple but full of meaning. He smiled, his hand reaching out to brush a stray lock of hair from her face. "You made it easy," he said, his voice soft. "Liar," she teased, but there was no malice in her words. "Yeah, but a happy one," he replied, his voice filled with something more than contentment. It was a deep, unshakable peace. The storm outside began to subside, the wind slowly dying down, but inside there was only quiet, only peace. Catherine stood then, moving to the window, her eyes gazing out at the night. Ezra joined her, wrapping his arms around her from behind, and they both stood there, watching the storm pass, the rain finally tapering off. "Are you ready for this?" Catherine asked, her voice full of quiet anticipation. Ezra didn't answer immediately. Instead, he placed a hand on her belly, feeling the life growing inside her. He could feel it. This new chapter of their lives, this new beginning. They had faced storms together, and now they would face whatever came next. Together. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice steady. "I'm ready." Outside, the storm passed, and in the distance, the first light of dawn began to break through the clouds. It was the beginning of a new day, a new life. Catherine squeezed Ezra's hand, a smile curving her lips. "Good," she said, her voice full of quiet certainty. "Because we're in this together. Always." And as they stood there, looking out at the world, they knew that whatever the future held, they would face it side by side, ready for anything, ready to build a life full of love, full of hope, and full of the quiet joy that only comes when two hearts choose each other every day. In the distance, the storm passed, and the world seemed to hold its breath. But inside, their home was warm, and their hearts were full. Finally, they were home, together.